What do we mean when we say global English?
English has grown up in a lot of different places around the world. There are variations in the way it's used.
It's about acceptance, and it's about not viewing one variation of English as the right or the goal.
Being sensitive to people from different countries and cultures it's a skill.
You're listening to the British Council English podcast, brought to you by the world's English experts.
Perfect. Welcome to English for Life. Today we're talking about world Englishes. English is a global phenomenon, and we're going to be looking at how that affects you and how that affects your learning. So yeah, from Nigeria to Singapore to Jamaica, English is used all around the world. And the interesting thing is that language teachers and researchers are thinking about how we can bring that into the classroom. Okay, what are the implications? Like, how is that going to affect learners, and how is that going to affect the learning journey? So first up, let's define our terms. What do we mean when we say global English?
Well, global English or world English is the idea that there isn't just one type of English, that English exists across the globe, across the world, in its multiple different variations. And it's the acceptance of the idea that there are these variations and each one is valid. So this is why we call it world Englishes or global English. And also the idea that English exists in lots of different fields as well, not just as a language of commerce or a language of education, but it's also used in science. It's also used in transportation, diplomacy. That's right. So it's a global language geographically and global in its context.
What he said, absolutely, yes, I totally agree with that. Yeah, that there are different dialects. There are different. It's used in different places all around the world, and each one of them is valid and is right. Yeah.
So okay. How does that affect our idea about the standard? So I mean, there's different ways to look at this. Do we have a single standard and then lots of variations surrounding it? Or do we have a completely equal level playing field? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there used to be this idea, and a lot of students still have this idea that there's this gold standard of English, which is either American English or British English, around the world, and they've got to learn this type of English.
Yeah.
And this idea of world English is, we talked about this earlier, that it's kind of a counter movement to colonization
and standardization of like the English.
Yeah. This appreciation that English has grown up in a lot of different places around the world, and there are variations in the way it's used. And pronunciations and its grammar and its vocabulary. And it's the acceptance of that. So that impacts what we consider as the standard. So the question is American English or British English the only way to speak or to learn?
Absolutely. Because then if they're native, so that's, native or English, then what about Canadians? What about Australians, etc.? Those who speak English. Well, in Canada, we have French.
The Anglosphere.
And yeah, exactly. So then why is it just American English and then British English that are the standard? Yeah.
So how does a standard get made? What's the process that we go through? You touched on colonialism there. We can sort of talk about it as almost linguistic imperialism. Think about the idea that you're kind of doing that. Potentially, it's a way to thinking about the idea that imposing a standard on a group of people could be violent in a way that it's restricting freedom.
Absolutely,
and the ability to make choices and to determine the way that we're going to use the language.
That's right.
So, but yeah, what's the process by which a standard comes into existence?
So it's a hard question. I mean,
we could think about the English language to narrow it down a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, something I'd like to touch on is that in quite a few countries, other languages, there are organizations or institutions that are the kind of maximum responsibility for the way a language is authorized. For example, in Spain, where I live and work, there's the RAE, the Royal Academy of Spanish, that says whether words are allowed in the dictionary or not. But this is not true for English. And a lot of people are surprised by that fact that this kind of body doesn't exist for the English language. There's no single authority that says this is allowed and this is not allowed. Yeah. And I think your question about the standard is related to that, because there is no body that says this is the way English should be written or spoken.
And then if we just think about language emerging and new expressions, for example, Gen Z expressions, you were just saying that there's an authority that says, okay, you can use this word and you can't use that word, right? But then what was the Oxford word of the year last year was? Can you tell us, Neil? He's offset, but can you tell us? You forgot, but it's not, it wasn't slay, but it was something similar to that. And then should we draw the line and say that that's not an English word and it's a new word? Like, then absolutely not. It's, it's emerging, it's new, and you can just add it, and there's no such thing as right or wrong if it's used by a lot of people, I guess.
So it's creating space for language to emerge, to change, to happen naturally. That's the way. That's absolutely the way it should be. And let's think more specifically. So can we think about some examples of global Englishes and how they might differ from the current standard?
There's. We were talking earlier about the number of countries around the world that have English as an official language, other than the Anglosphere, right?
88 countries.
88 countries around the world. So we've got places like India, Nigeria, Singapore, where else? Belize,
vast parts of the Caribbean.
That's right. All over the Caribbean, where English is either the official or co-official languages, alongside other very different languages from other language families, and in many of these cases, the English in those countries has been around for a long time, and it's developed quite differently from the English of the Anglosphere. And so they've got their own literary traditions, their own writers, authors, poets, film and music in the English language, but with a flavor of that country.
Absolutely. Because language is life. You use it to showcase and to show and to represent your culture. So if you don't add that, flavor and that your character, your personality, your culture in that language, then are you truly using it? Are you truly living and using that language? So if, you just said, for example, the Caribbeans using English, of course they're going to make it their own and use it in their everyday. They're not going to...
Right, they're going to have things from their country which don't exist in others, and
absolutely.
They have to describe those things.
Exactly, yes. They're not going to, wear a different persona while using the English language. They're going to make it their own,
No, actually, that's how. The Caribbean is a spectacular example because of the Creoles that have come out there, Creoles being essentially like a mixture of different languages that gets passed down different generations. And so in Jamaica, you've got Jamaican Creole, which is kind of Hindi and German and Chinese and French. It's just beautiful mixture of all of those languages. I think that's the vision of language that we want. It's that there are no lines, imaginary lines around things. We're free to communicate. And the point is communication. And it's part of natural processes of change.
Absolutely. For some reason, that guy from TikTok that says, Habibi, come to Dubai. Do you guys know?
No, don't know it.
The problem of talking to people who don't know TikTok. So basically but it's this guy that says, Habibi, come to Dubai. And right now everyone is saying it because it's trending on TikTok. But then some people understand what Habibi means.
Right?
Doesn't it mean like my love or my friend?
Exactly.
It's got so many uses.
Exactly.
Between friends, between lovers.
And do you mean that's being used by people around the world, even if they're not Arabic speakers?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And now it's a catchphrase to say, come to this place, or I'll show you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
You can cut that out if you want.
But thinking now about how this is going to affect our students. So learning World Englishes, how does that help our students?
Yeah, well, as a classroom teacher, I'm I keep an eye out on bits of news from around the world to bring into the classroom and to show my students, especially video and audio, where they can hear the accents of different varieties of English. So I love bringing them stories from not just other English-speaking countries like Australia. I mean, they do enjoy watching videos about weird Australian animals and that kind of thing. But news from there was recently a piece of news where a British man ran the length of Africa and he did interviews in lots of different. That's it. Yeah, I can't remember his name.
It ended in Tunisia.
Yeah, in Tunisia. That's right. Yeah,
Represent.
But he was running for a year, and he did interviews in lots of different countries with local people there, and we heard different varieties of English in all the different interviews that he did. And so, bringing those voices, those different pronunciations, helps students to broaden their idea of what English could be in those different places around the world. Makes them more sensitive to the variations.
Absolutely. It's about representation and understanding, the fact that there are different cultures or people who use or speak English. And it's about acceptance, and it's about not seeing that or not viewing one variation of English as the right or the goal. Yeah. In terms of accent or pronunciation or whatever. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think this is wonderful. It seems we've got two things here. Number one, it seems to be helping students to get a sense that maybe their cultural background is being brought into the classroom. So it's not just we're learning about these other cultures. Yeah. It's, okay, the people from back home are using English and we're learning about that form in the classroom. Exactly. But also it makes them more sensitive to variations. Okay.
This is what some educators have talked about as the fifth skill. So we've got reading, writing, listening, and speaking.
Intercultural.
And the fifth skill is intercultural competence or intercultural communication skills. So learning how to interact with people from different cultures and different countries. Nowadays, our students are going out into the global workplace, and they're going to be traveling for work, for holiday, for pleasure, and knowing how to interact with people, from being sensitive to people from different countries and cultures it's a skill.
It is.
Absolutely.
And that should be trained and prepared for.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. And in terms of the workforce, so future, do we think that employers will be seeking out people who can demonstrate that they have a good understanding of all these different global forms of English?
I think it is very important to at least be able to communicate with people who use or who have different variations or dialects. Absolutely, yes. Because then if you only speak a certain or understand a certain accent or variation, then you're
limited.
Yeah, exactly. You are. And can you really use it then with everyone? You can't. So you need to train your ear a little bit.
You've reminded me of, quite a few students have told me this, and these are professionals in Spain, and they said they do international meetings with people from other parts of the world. Let's say a Spanish person doing a meeting with a French person, Italian.
Exactly.
So these meetings are run in English, and the communication's fine until a native speaker joins in the meeting. A British person comes along, starts using expressions very local to the UK, or
absolutely.
Because of the accent, that they don't understand how they don't understand international English.
Exactly.
And so this is where training native speakers with intercultural competence is also valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of thinking more about the classroom now, let's think about assessment. So how would we assess students' abilities to speak in different languages? Because at the moment, testing is normally about the standards. So the IELTS test is not assessing students' ability to use Canadian English specifically or Singaporean English specifically. Right. What would future testing look like?
If I may, it's not about using those dialects or those accents, but it's about understanding them and being able to communicate, right? So maybe by incorporating different listening examples from different cultures, different media sources, etc., opening them up to, or showcasing these different accents and including them in tests like the IELTS. That would be very important.
Yeah. I mean, quite often you find that in these tests, especially in the audios for the listening, the voices that they use come from a very limited set of accent choices. And Zina said, perhaps introducing voices from around the world, the concept of global English is actually incorporated into the test, would mean that in training for the test, students are, I don't want to say forced, but they're encouraged to listen more widely.
Absolutely.
And take that on board as they're preparing for the test. We could say the same thing about productive skills, about like writing and speaking. And within the marking rubrics that examiners use to evaluate, if those concepts are included, certain acceptance for greater dialect variation, pronunciation variation, could change the way teachers prepare their students.
Yeah, absolutely. I think productive skills are particularly difficult. One idea would be to make the tests more contextual. So if you specifically want to go and study or work in a country, the test could be adapted for that context. So if I want to go and work in Singapore, the test might be slightly different. So I might need to prove that I'm able to use certain forms that are unique to Singapore. It's an idea.
That makes sense. Yeah, totally. So if you're going to go and work and integrate in a particular place, then you need to have some familiarity with the local way of speaking.
Yeah. It's great for employers. You can demonstrate that you can use those forms as well.
Yeah.
But teaching it, how would we go about teaching World Englishes? So what would you could maybe imagine a typical lesson that you might want to teach on Japanese English or...
Would we then create one lesson for World English, or should we incorporate it in each and every class to normalize it?
Yeah.
So it's not something that's, this is fresh and new, or we're just going to look at it once and then move on, but incorporate it to make it the norm. Right?
Depends on the students.
Depends on the students. I
mean, what you're talking about is drip feeding in over an extensive course.
Yes.
Let's say a course running over the length of a year.
Yeah.
And perhaps you've got, let's say, a group of teenage students.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah, throughout the year. Yeah.
And then you drip feed in.
Exactly. Yeah,
not every class is based on World English, but maybe every month you have a class that's dedicated to English from a certain part of the world.
Yeah.
I love that idea. That's
and then
great.
maybe we can explore that country and try to learn more about that country if we're teaching YLs or teenagers. That could be really interesting, and that can also maybe be very culturally motivating. And
you cover lots of subjects like geography and a bit of history and
why not?
culture, and students get a complete pack with that kind of approach.
Yeah, that could be cool.
Yeah, and I was thinking of another situation where you've got students with very specific needs. So in my case, an example was some Spanish employees for an insurance company who had to communicate regularly with Indian colleagues who worked in the IT department. And I was tasked with the preparation of these students, the Spanish students, in helping them to understand Indian English and the particular idiosyncrasies of the pronunciation of Indian English, and even the changes in the grammatical forms and understanding their colleagues better. And so this was a series of lessons dedicated to Indian English with a strong cultural element as well. And that's for students with a very, very specific need. So I think it depends on the profile of the students and what their needs are.
Yeah.
If I want to share an anecdote, and this is quite interesting actually. I know this man, he's American, right? And he lives in Saudi. And he cannot order food. Like he cannot call, he can order food, but basically you need to call the restaurant and place your order, right? And sometimes the person who's answering the phone might be from India or Bangladesh, etc. And he just does not understand or cannot talk to them. So then he passes the phone to someone else who's Arab, who also speaks English.
But they're speaking in English.
But they speak in English. Yeah. And again, this man is American, but he does not know how to communicate.
Because he's probably not ever been exposed to Indian English or Bangladeshi English.
Exactly.
Not used to hearing those accents.
No. Yeah. Then how do you explain that? How do you like that? Then of course we need to. What I'm trying to say is even native speakers sometimes do not know how to communicate and understand different variations of English.
So there is definitely a practical value here, as well as thinking about it in social justice terms, and the fact we want to make sure that we're not just promoting one standard version of English to rule them all. Actually, no, the English language is something that can be used by anyone, anywhere, for any purpose, and you're in charge, you're in control. Turn it to your own uses, absolutely.
And from a student's perspective, don't feel that what you speak is not valid. Your variation of English is any less valid than another variation of English.
Brilliant. So just going to begin sort of wrapping up. Final question would be, what can students do to build confidence with World English? What can they do now to...
Well, you want to go first?
No, you go for it. I'm still thinking.
Practicing, being conscious of including exposure to different dialects particularly in your receptive skills practice, so listening and reading. If you're watching movies and films, doing a bit of investigation about where those accents come from. If you're watching in the original version in English, finding out where those particular accents come from, and being aware that, for example, there's no such thing as the American accent or the British. Even within those native speaker countries, there's so much variation depending on the region. Yeah. And doing a bit of digging around, finding out where these accents actually come from, gives you greater awareness of how much variation there is.
And I feel like they also have this great tool, which is social media. And then they're exposed to different accents as well, different content creators, different people who post online and who speak English, but they're not from an English speaking country or from a native, America or, the UK, etc. So then they're exposed to those accents and those different variations of English. So that's great then. That's it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Zina. Thank you very much, Neeraj.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much for listening. And if you liked today's episode, give us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're always uploading content, so there will always be something for you to sort of dive into and enjoy. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. We really care about your English, so if you like this episode, make sure you subscribe because we've got lots more great content for you to explore.